How to beat every single UFC legend, Georges St-Pierre. Okay, Georges St-Pierre, as we all know, is one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, has one of the greatest takedowns of all time. That's the first thing you're going to need to at least survive against this guy. You're going to need takedown defense, of course. You know, Georges St-Pierre is arguably the greatest of all time, but we've seen this guy lose before. And you can say it's not in his prime, but at the end of the day, all we have to go off of in terms of areas he's struggled is his losses. So I think the style to beat Georges St-Pierre is a super high level kickboxer that can defend his takedowns. We've seen Georges St-Pierre get knocked out before. I think the way to beat him is by kicking his legs and doing body work. And I think the best way to do it is to stay at range and use kicks. I really do. And you know, it's going to help if you have a range. It's going to help if you have great power. You know, the biggest threat Georges St-Pierre has, in my opinion, is his pressure and his cardio and his grappling. Those are like the clear things that made Georges St-Pierre so dominant. And kicking the legs, doing damage to the legs and body, that's like the biggest way to take the wind out of his sails, to get this guy off of you. Because when you watch a Georges St-Pierre fight, you know he's going for that takedown. Unless we're talking about the Georges St-Pierre of old, when he used to finish people in like the first minute, he's going to go and take you down. So I think elite takedown defense and elite kickboxing, as well as being lengthier than him, would help with the kickboxing. I think that's the way to beat Georges St-Pierre, which, to be honest, nobody really has that until you start getting into the light heavyweight division, really. I think there's some middleweights that could beat Georges St-Pierre. People talk about Anderson Silva. You know, he could probably beat St-Pierre. I think even like a middleweight Alex Pereira, that's a hot take, but I think he could beat Georges St-Pierre. But those are dudes who are up a weight class and are massive for the division, or at least Alex Pereira is. That's the type of archetype, the type of style to beat Georges St-Pierre. You know, because if you look at a guy like Alex Pereira, his ground game is pretty low level, especially in comparison to Georges St-Pierre, but he has the size to at least help him in defending takedowns from GSP. And he's lengthy enough to stay at range and kick him apart. You know, Alex Pereira is 6'4", 230 pounds. Georges St-Pierre is like 5'10", 183 pounds or something he said that he walks around at. That's what you're going to need to beat a guy like Georges St-Pierre. You're going to need somebody a lot bigger, because I don't think there's any current or previous welterweight or anybody lighter that can beat Georges St-Pierre. But Anderson Silva's next. And I think Anderson Silva is one of the most simple legends to beat in this video. I think it's just wrestling. Really good wrestling, pressure, cardio. You know, we've seen him basically lose against Chael Sonnen, okay? Chael Sonnen won that fight until the last seconds, basically, when he got choked out. If Chael Sonnen didn't get choked out, that would have been an insanely dominant victory over what people think is one of the greatest fighters of all time. That's Chael Sonnen. There's guys out there like Khamzat Chimaev. I think Khamzat Chimaev is the absolute kryptonite of Anderson Silva. Like, I'm going to be honest, I think Khamzat Chimaev would tear prime Anderson Silva to shreds. He's bigger, he's stronger, his grappling's insane. Even a guy like Dricus du Plessis, these modern middleweights that are so big and are well-rounded, I think would be a big threat to Anderson Silva. DDP's kind of a different story because, you know, there's a chance that Anderson Silva just exposes his striking because of how unorthodox it is. Anderson Silva's a great counterpuncher. There's that chance, but with a guy like Khamzat Chimaev, who's going to try to take him down from the moment the bell rings, I think that's the clear way to beat Anderson Silva. But Khabib's next. I think the way to beat Khabib is just being a fighter who's super well-rounded at everything and has great cardio. I think the person that would do that would be Georges St-Pierre. Yes, he's up a weight class, but I'm going to be honest, I think Georges St-Pierre, if he really tried, could make 155. I don't know if that version of Georges St-Pierre could beat Khabib, but regardless, the style Georges St-Pierre has, I think is the way to beat Khabib, because I think Georges St-Pierre has the takedown defense to be able to at least be competitive and keep the fight on the feet. I think even if Khabib did score a takedown, GSP is going to know how to get up. He's not going to be like Justin Gaethje, helpless on the ground. And he's not going to gas out like some of these fighters like McGregor. Georges St-Pierre is going to be composed. He's going to know how to get up. He's going to have the cardio to do it. And then once the fight's on the feet, for at least, you know, a portion of the fight, I think Georges St-Pierre would excel. Somebody with good boxing, good kickboxing. I think Georges St-Pierre would jab the face off Khabib. But I think the real emphasis on this is the cardio. Because, you know, there's Islam Makhachev, who people think, you know, would beat Khabib. People call him the lightweight GOAT. They think he would beat Khabib in a fight. The only reason I think Khabib would win that fight against Islam Makhachev is the cardio. I just don't know if Islam Makhachev has the cardio to do damage on the feet after getting involved in those wrestling exchanges. Because I think when you're fighting a guy like Khabib, also like a guy like Khamzat, getting in wrestling scrambles is a non-negotiable. Like, you're going to wrestle with them at some point in the fight. And I think if Islam Makhachev wrestled with Khabib, after a certain point later in the fight, he would get tired quicker than Khabib. So I think the George St. Pierre style, the great boxing and kickboxing mixed with the cardio, basically just a well-rounded, one of the greatest fighters of all time, I think that's the way to beat Khabib. But Demetrious Johnson's next. Here's the thing with Demetrious Johnson. You're going to have physicality. I think really that's the main thing to beat him. You're not going to out chess match a guy like Demetrious Johnson. He's one of, if not the most technical and skilled fighter of all time. I don't think, trying to outskill Demetrious Johnson is the approach. I think having knockout power and durability and cardio, really just like physical attributes, being bigger than Demetrious Johnson, that's like your only hope at beating this guy. I think, that's why the Pantoja fight's kind of interesting. Pantoja's, I don't think anywhere close to the skill level of Demetrious Johnson, but the fact that Pantoja's pretty big, he's really durable, and he has cardio and he just keeps pushing forward and kind of makes the fight ugly. I think that's the way you would beat Demetrious Johnson. You can't get all technical with him. He's just going to outskill you, bro. It's Demetrious Johnson. But Daniel Cormier's next. And we kind of know how to beat Daniel Cormier, right? Jon Jones pretty much showed us how to do it. And Stipe Miocic too a little bit. I think the Jon Jones method is the best method. And it's kind of just being lengthier than him, which basically most heavyweights and light heavyweights are, and using the kickboxing and having wrestling, all right? And we're talking about some of the greatest legends of the sport, so there's not many fighters that kind of fit the blueprint. And I think Jon Jones is one of the only ones that does it. You're going to need the takedown defense. You're going to need the grappling skills like Jon Jones has, as well as the kickboxing. I think the kickboxing is really where it's at on the feet. Daniel Cormier, I mean, in terms of reach, like he's completely undersized. And I think the best way to beat him is just picking and prodding from distance like Jon Jones does, kicking the legs. Jon Jones did get up close and dirty a little bit with him, but, in the second fight, he landed that head kick. I think stuff like that is, the best way to beat Daniel Cormier. I think the Jon Jones performances against Daniel Cormier is the way to beat him. But now Jon Jones is next. And I think the way to beat Jon Jones, I talked about this already in one of my other videos, but it's the boxing and takedown defense. Dominic Reyes, I think, is the blueprint to beat Jon Jones. He had the takedown defense and he had the boxing. He also had the cardio too as well, I forgot to mention. That is how you beat Jon Jones. A guy like Dominic Reyes, a guy like Tom Aspinall, and we've seen him literally get beat by Dominic Reyes. It was a close fight, but Dominic Reyes won 3 rounds to 2, and the 3 rounds that he won were straight up from just pushing Jon and putting him on the back foot and boxing him. And during those rounds, he was defending a couple of takedowns. And I think those two guys with great takedown defense, both of them have great takedown defense and great boxing. That's kind of the kryptonite for Jon Jones. But Conor McGregor's next. And, Conor McGregor's lost a couple of times, so I think there's multiple ways to do it. We've seen him lose in different types of ways, but I think the best way to do it is just having cardio and an ability to wrestle hard. We saw the Khabib fight. We saw what happened. That was straight up just pressure wrestling. For the most part, it was Conor McGregor's just getting completely out pressured and out grappled. And we've seen that a little bit with Nate Diaz, except Nate Diaz was like the striking version of that. He out pressured him by, being able to weather the storm of an early Conor McGregor round and then putting the pressure on him in the later rounds. Even with his fight against Chad Mendes kind of took the Khabib approach, except Chad Mendes is much smaller and less strong and less technical as Khabib. It was basically like the Walmart Khabib. His game plan was there, his execution was not. He was just not good enough. I think that's the most solid way to beat Conor McGregor. There's also the way Dustin Poirier did it, which is he just outstruck McGregor. He kicked the shit out of his leg and he outboxed him. Like, there's a couple different ways to beat him, but if we're talking about the prime Conor McGregor, I don't think, prime McGregor was fighting Dustin Poirier. He was at his prime age in terms of physicality, I think, maybe towards the end of it, but you also have to take in mind that this guy was, I don't think, living the lifestyle of a top-level martial artist. I think the best way, the safest way to do it is just having cardio and the wrestling. Obviously, you're going to have striking. You can't just be a bum on the feet. He's going to knock you out. You got to be, Khabib's the blueprint. Khabib's really the blueprint. But the last person in this video is Jose Aldo. We've seen Jose Aldo get beat in his prime. Jose Aldo was 29 when he got knocked out by McGregor. Jose Aldo was in his early 30s when he got beat by Max Holloway. And you can say that he had tons of miles on him. He was fighting all the time. But at the end of the day, the point is that everybody that beat him was a great striker. And I think the way to beat Jose Aldo is being a great striker. But what McGregor and Holloway and even Volkanovski all had in common was that they actually had a size advantage. Jose Aldo's not a big featherweight. And we can see that by the fact that he just late in his career, he cut down to 135. Those guys had the reach advantage. They had the size advantage. Even Volkanovski, who's short, he has an insane reach. He has like a 6-foot reach or something like that. McGregor has an insane reach. Holloway is just tall. Those guys are great rangy strikers, super high level strikers that were able to beat him. I think that's the way you beat Jose Aldo. I don't think taking Jose Aldo down is the best idea. Jose Aldo has insane takedown defense. And, I think the way to beat Jose Aldo is just either catching him or just being one of these crazy high level strikers like Max Holloway that can just put him away with straight out outclassing him on the feet. Because that's really what happened. The Conor McGregor fight, you can talk about all the circumstances behind it. If that fight happened again, maybe he doesn't get finished that early. I can agree with that, but at the end of the day, I think McGregor would have beat him regardless. I think the power and the size of Conor McGregor is a huge factor. And I think the biggest weakness of Jose Aldo, to be honest, is just his size for the division. But let me know what you guys think about this. Do you think there's better ways of beating these UFC legends? Let me know in the comments below. If you guys like this video, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'll see you guys in the next one.